Hey guys, today's video is 10 tips for beginners on the devotion tree in Grim Dawn. Tip 1, you're starting out, you're looking at all these constellations and you're feeling a bit overwhelmed. What do you do? How do you make your life easier? You use the search bar. We're a cold damage build here, so we were to start out by looking at nodes that support cold damage. We would see most of them, and as you can see, we have a good number of them checked as well. If you are doing cold, fire, or lightning damage, percent elemental damage increase is the same as percent cold, fire, or lightning damage increases respectively. So you can search for elemental damage as well. Note that flat elemental damage, so if it says it gives you 10 extra elemental damage, that's going to be split 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And last but not least, any build can search and benefit from percent all damage. Tip 2 is understanding devotion tiers and affinity. So you start out with Crossroads, and once you put a point in Crossroads, you have access to a tier 1 devotion. A tier 1 devotion is defined as a devotion constellation where, for instance, like Turtle here, you look at affinity requirements, it requires 1 affinity. So you would take a yellow Crossroads, you would complete Turtle, and then you look and you see this constellation completion bonus gives you 2 yellow and 3 blue. So once Turtle is complete, you no longer need this Crossroads because it's what we call self-sustaining. So that's tier 1. Tier 2 devotions are a bit further up. An example, if you are using a two-handed weapon, is Kraken, which requires 5 green and 5 blue, but still gives you 2 red and 3 blue. Revenant is another example. We were using it in this build. It requires 8 red. It gives you 1 red and 1 blue. And finally, you have tier 3 devotions. In our build, we're using Ugal, and we also have a couple of nodes in Torch here. But as you can see from both of these, they have affinity requirements that are the highest, and they don't actually give you any affinity for completing them. This brings us to tip 3. Pick the tier 3 devotions you want and figure out how to work your way towards them. In my case, we chose Ugal, and you see here it requires 7 red and 20 green. And we also look at some of our other devotions. For instance, Torch here requires 8 red and 15 green. And Revenant requires 8 red and gives, again, very little. So we need 8 red and 20 green. And we also look and see, okay, well, we're going to take Murmur here, and that requires 6 blue, so that's just one additional thing to be aware of. Once you figured out what tier 3 devotion you're going to use and how to make sure you're getting here and also able to get all of the affinity requirements for lower tier devotions, you should pretty much be good to go. And that's going to help you figure out your devotion pathing for the game. Tip 4 is every damage type has a -% resistance devotion. Take this devotion. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is that this type of resistance reduction stacks with as many other types of the same resistance reduction as you can get. So it's always going to increase your resistance reduction to your main damage type. Resistances can go negative, so no matter what, it's going to be a damage multiplier, and you're going to be heavily nerfing yourself if you're not taking this devotion for whatever your main damage type is. As a general rule, minus without the word reduced means it stacks with other debuffs of the same type, so that's worth keeping in mind. Contrary-wise is tip 5. If it says reduced, it doesn't stack. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. We have Revenant here, 24 reduced targets resistances for 1 second. If we had another source which had higher reduced targets resistances, then Revenant would be superfluous, since only the highest applies when you have two of the same debuff that's, say, reduced on them. You also have percent reduced, which this stacks multiplicatively, so that means it will typically, for resistance reduction, not be the full 20% that's listed here, because it's going to be multiplicative based on what the enemy's resistances are. So unless they're exactly 100%, it's not going to be 20%, it'll be less. Interesting point to note for Viper, it says this nowhere, but this only applies fully if you're doing 100% weapon damage on some skill. There's no reason that you would know that, but that's just something to be aware of. That's true only for Viper. The vast majority are going to have this apply universally, or at least apply on skill-specific issues. Tip 6 is you can refund devotion points. I sort of hinted at this when I was talking about once you get Turtle, you don't need this. You can go to a spirit guide and you can refund this devotion point. This is also important because there are going to be cases where you temporarily need extra affinity to take one of your tier 2 devotions. Revenant's the example here. It requires 8. It gives you 1 red. And as you see in our devotion page, we're finished and we have 8 red. So obviously we have 7 red without Revenant being complete, which means we can't start Revenant. So you do something like take Jackal for 3 red, get the affinity to start Revenant. Once you finish Revenant, you will then be able to go to the Spirit Guide and refund Jackal. Tip 7 is read the fine print on devotions. Kraken, we talked about earlier, requires a 2-handed melee or 2-handed ranged weapon. These nodes only give you a benefit if it is a 2-handed melee or 2-handed ranged weapon you're using. Otherwise, they are completely wasted. A couple of other examples of that would be Hydra, which requires a ranged weapon. Berserker requires an axe or spear. And Blades of Nadan requires a sword. So if you're not using the appropriate weapon type, or shield or offhand, depending on what's in the devotion, you're not going to get any benefit from those nodes, and they're going to be completely wasted. Tip 8 is you don't always have to finish a constellation. You can just take the devotion proc and not finish it, depending on how your devotion plan is working and whether you need the extra affinity from finishing the constellation. A couple of examples of when people do this are you can take Elemental Storm for resistance reduction in some cases and not take the last 2 nodes here. And Crab, you have Arcane Barrier. A lot of people will get here and not take these last 2 nodes, especially if they're not benefiting the main damage type that they're doing. So this is true for pretty much any devotion. And if you're taking a tier 3 devotion and you want the proc, it's possible that you might not be able to get all the nodes. There are cases where, say, you take the Shifting Sands proc, but you can't complete this node. So you don't have to complete constellations if you don't need the affinity. And sometimes your devotion plan is going to require you not completing a constellation. Tip 9 is to be generally aware of useful nodes that might not directly factor into your path to your tier 3 devotion, but are still helpful. We have Torch here, even though we are not a fire build, because the second node of Torch gives 5% offensive ability. Another place where you might take useful nodes is Manticore. The foot here gives 250 health and 15 offensive ability, which is nice. If you're not an acid build, the second node is useless, but the third gives percent health and the fourth gives physical resistance and offensive ability. So 1 or 4 part Manticore can be something that somebody would take. If you're playing a Chaos build and taking Abomination, this node does not support Chaos damage, but 400 health and 40 offensive ability is very nice. And if you have this space, is often going to be worth taking, even though you'd think, oh, this is on the acid side of this constellation. But then you look and see that even the non-poison and vitality decay component is very good. Finally, tip 10 is coordinate your devotion procs as best you can with the cooldowns on the skills that are proccing them. Like you have something like Revenant here. You want to make sure that this is proccing fairly often, so ideally you want it on a weapon pool skill, on or on your auto attack. You have Blade Spirits here proccing Blizzard. You have Shadow Strike, which is pretty low cooldown, proccing Rumor. Some of these could be changed or improved somewhat, but like you don't want to be in a situation where you have an ultra low cooldown devotion proc. For example, Shifting Sands 0.5 seconds, and you're using a skill that has a 5-second cooldown. This is almost never going to proc if you're doing that. So be aware of that. And finally, just a bonus tip going back to Affinity is there are some constellations that you take to make your Affinity work in your devotion tree. Going back to looking at some of the tier 1 devotions, we see Eel, 3 nodes, 5 affinity points. We see Wraith, 4 nodes, 6 affinity points if you're taking blue and purple. And if you are taking purple and green, you have Quill, which is 4 nodes for 6, and Toad is also 4 nodes for 6. You'll also see cases where if you need 4 purple, you can get it with 3 nodes for Hammer, and things like Owl and Throne give you 5 for 4 nodes, whereas there are going to be some other devotions which aren't going to give you quite as much efficiency. So sometimes you just have to take a particular tier 1 devotion for the affinity, and even if it's not necessarily the best thing for your build. That about wraps up this video. Hope it was helpful. I'll be continuing to put together various beginner videos and guides. Please feel free to leave any questions or comments in the comments section below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.